All right, well, welcome everyone. In case we haven't met, I'm Zach. Uh, I'm the teaching and young adults pastor here at New Vine. And today we're finishing up our series called Full. And what I'd like to do to get us started is I'd like you to think about, have there been any times in your life where you felt like you're at a loss for words? Think about those times in life where you feel like you're at a loss for words. I think this can often happen in the good times in life. When things are at their height, when things are going well, we can sometimes it can just leave us speechless in awe of the goodness of God. But I think it's also in the depths of life as well that we can feel at a loss for words. Sometimes it's in those moments when we're facing the reality of the brokenness of our world that we can feel like we're at a loss for words. Over the past few weeks, as I mentioned, we've been doing this series called Full, living life to the full when life is so full. And we've been looking at the early chapters in Ecclesiastes and how life under the sun can often leave us feeling so busy and so frustrated, and it can sometimes leave us feeling like the life that we live it seems meaningless. And today we're going to finish up this series, and we're going to be looking at the book of Romans. We're going to be leaving the book of Ecclesiastes and looking at Romans today, and Romans chapter 8, verses 18 to 27. So if you have your Bibles or Bible apps, could I encourage you to open them up there? Romans chapter 8, verses 18 to 27. We're going to be looking there. And the reason that I want to finish up this series in this passage is because it gives us some helpful insights into the state that the world is in. As I said, sometimes life can leave us feeling like we're at a loss for words in those depths of life where we're processing the news in the doctor's office, when we're coming to terms with the end of a relationship, or when we're just even trying to comprehend the injustices that we see in our world. Sometimes life can leave us at a loss for words. And this passage, it gives us some insight into why the world is the way that it is. And therefore, it can help us understand why our lives so often feel so full. But this passage also speaks to those times in life where life doesn't just feel full, it feels overwhelming. It speaks to those times where it's like we've come to the end of ourselves and we're at a loss for words. And it might be because of the pain that we're experiencing personally, but sometimes this happens because of the pain that we see others going through, the pain that we see in those around us, the pain that we see in the world around us. And so in this passage in Romans 8, there's two resources which it gives us to help us deal with this experience, to help us deal with our full lives, especially when our lives feel so full they're overwhelming. Those two resources are lament and hope. And that's what I'd like us to explore this morning. I'd like to unpack what I mean by lament and hope. These two things, they might seem contradictory. You know, they might seem like they're two opposite ends of the spectrum, but actually these two things, lament and hope, they go hand in hand. And in the Bible, we'll often see these two things being brought together, especially in the book of Psalms and especially in our passage this morning in Romans 8. So I'd like to explore the ways in which these two resources, lament and hope, can help us to deal with the overwhelmingly full times in life. So I'd like to invite up my wife, Grace, who's going to be reading our passage this morning in Romans 8. Yes, she deserves a round of applause, I think. She's wonderful. All right, thanks, Grace.
I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. For the creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. For the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of those who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought to freedom and glory of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. Not only so, but we ourselves, who have the first fruit of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption to the sonship, the redemption of our bodies. For in this hope we were saved. But hope that is seen is not hope at all. Who hopes for what they already have? But if we hope for what we do not yet have, we wait for it patiently. In the same way, the Spirit helps us in our weaknesses. We do not know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us through the wordless groans. And he who searches our hearts knows the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for God's people in accordance with the will of God.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, so throughout this series, we've been talking about how even though life so often feels so full, the good news is we can still experience Jesus' abundant life here in the midst of our full lives. So we've talked about whether it's tapping into God's time, as DJ mentioned last week, or whether it's finding purpose in the things that we do in our labor, in our work, or whether it's looking to Jesus through the repetitious cycles of life, or finding and enjoying the good things in life, even when they're fleeting. In all these things, we can experience a taste of Jesus' abundant life here in the midst of our full lives. And that's a good thing. And it's wonderful that we are able to experience that. It comes down to the pure goodness and generosity of God that we have these moments in life. But there are also times in life where we might just want to let out a scream, you know? There are times when the things that fill our lives are so painful and so overwhelming that we feel like we're just about to burst. And our passage this morning speaks to this feeling. It's using this word groaning, which we see throughout the passage. This is a really strong word. It's a really emotional word. It's an emotively potent word, groaning. It's used to express pain. And in Greek literature, this word often comes up in contexts where people are facing death. It's like a death cry, this word groaning. So often it's used to describe the crying and groaning of soldiers on a battlefield. So if you imagine the smoke clears and the battle's over and the wounded are crying and groaning out, that's this kind of word. Here in our passage, interestingly, it's connected to childbirth. Now, I'm a bit hesitant to say anything about the pain of childbirth, as you can imagine. So I'm not going to go into any details because I have none. But there is something that I do want to say. What I do want to say is that throughout most of human history, and still for many, many women today, childbirth is a near-death experience. Many, many women throughout human history died due to childbirth. It's kind of like this time where that gap between life and death gets thinned and even overlaps because it's a near-death experience that results in new life. And so this word groaning, it's like this death cry, but in the midst of it is this hope for new life, this hope that there is something more to come. So the word groaning comes up a bunch of times in this passage. Who's groaning in this passage? Well, first, we've got creation that's groaning in this passage. This world, our world, this material world, the birds and the trees and the rocks, this world is groaning. It's crying out in death pain. It's groaning, according to this passage, because it's been subjected to frustration and a bondage to decay. This is what we looked at the beginning of this series. So quite a few weeks ago now, we looked at Genesis chapter 3. And in that passage, Adam and Eve have just sinned, and there were consequences for creation itself. There were consequences for the ground itself. God said to Adam that cursed is the ground because of you, that the ground will now produce thorns and thistles. The fruitfulness of the ground has now been replaced with thorns and thistles. We pointed out at the start of this series that the ground, that although Adam and Eve sinned, humanity wasn't cursed. The ground was cursed. Creation was. So what we do affects the world around us. And the world around us, creation itself, has been subjected to frustration. Now, I want to dig into this word frustration because it might not be obvious, but this word frustration links us back to the book of Ecclesiastes. This is a little bit nerdy, but I will be brief. We've been talking about the Hebrew word hevel throughout this series. This is the word that comes up again and again and again throughout the book of Ecclesiastes. It literally means smoke or vapor, but in Ecclesiastes it often means vanity or meaningless. Now, here's the nerdy part. A couple of hundred years before Jesus, there was a translation of the Old Testament. The Old Testament was translated into Greek. And in the ancient Greek translation, in this ancient Greek translation of the book of Ecclesiastes, this word hevel was translated with this same word, mataiates, in case you're wondering, which means frustration here in our passage in Romans chapter 8, verse 20. So in other words, creation was subjected to hevel. That's why so much of what we experience in Ecclesiastes speaks to our experience of life. Creation has been subjected to this futility, that life here under the sun, life as we currently experience it, is a world of hevel, a world which has been subjected to this frustration. So as a result, creation itself is groaning. Creation itself is crying out in death pain. But creation's not the only thing groaning in this passage. We also are groaning along with creation. So within this broken and groaning world are broken and groaning humans. In verse 23, it says that we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, are groaning inwardly. I mean, I don't know about you, but for me, that was a bit surprising. I kind of expected to hear that we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, can rejoice in our sufferings or something like that, not groan. Now, that is true, and there are other passages in the Bible which talk about rejoicing in our sufferings, but not here. That's not Paul's point here in Romans 8. See, God's Spirit does not minimize or remove or replace our groanings here in Romans 8. In fact, as we'll see later on in this passage, the Spirit of God himself groans along with us on our behalf, in fact. So this passage gives us a bit of a different angle on what it means to be filled with the Spirit. We talk about this in church circles sometimes, being filled with the Spirit. And we often talk about celebration and excitement and being empowered. Those things are all true, and they're all a part of what it means to be filled with the Spirit. But the Holy Spirit is also the Spirit of the Creator God, who grieves over his world gone wrong. The Holy Spirit is also the Spirit of Jesus. Jesus who went to the cross. Jesus who bore our sin and death. And this passage is speaking about the Spirit of God who is groaning over the state of our world. This passage is tapping into a deep biblical tradition of lament. And so I want to talk a bit about what lament means. Maybe it's a bit of a strange word. Maybe you don't talk about lament often. But have you ever opened up the book of Psalms and you've gone there because you're like, I want to read something uplifting and encouraging. You've opened up the book of Psalms and you've been a bit disappointed because all that's there is doom and gloom. You keep turning from next psalm to the next psalm to the next, and it's all, God, why have you abandoned me? God, stop sleeping. All these kinds of things. It's like, what's going on here? See, the majority of Psalms in our Bible, in fact, 2/3 of the Psalms in the book of Psalms are laments. See, lamenting is the very place that Paul is going to in this passage when he speaks about groaning. In fact, later on, when he speaks about God being the one who searches our hearts, he's quoting Psalm 44 there. And Psalm 44 is a lament psalm. So Paul's going to lament. See, lament is that cry that you let out when things are not the way that they should be. It's a cry to God, a cry for God to act in our world, to make wrongs right. If you read it in the Psalms, it often sounds really bold and sometimes even it sounds almost blasphemous. But before we start attributing blasphemy to the authors of Scripture, I think there's something important to remember about lament. See, lament is actually an act of faith. Because to lament is to believe that God is the one who can do something. That when we are facing the hard times in life, when we're facing the kind of suffering that so many people do in this world, God, as King of our world, can do something about our world. Lament would be an act of delusion if we didn't believe that God can respond to our lament. So far from being blasphemous, lamenting is an exercise in faith. And this is what we see in the book of Psalms. So in these moments in life, when life not only feels full, but it feels overwhelming, when we're not only busy, but we feel like we're at the end of ourselves, we have this rich biblical tradition of lament in the book of Psalms, which we can draw on. But also, maybe that's not where you're at in life. Maybe you don't feel like you're at the end of yourself. Maybe you don't feel like life is overwhelming. Maybe it's full and busy, but perhaps not overwhelming in the way that I'm describing here. I also want to say that lament doesn't need to be an individual act. Lament can also be a communal one. See, we can cry out to God in lament for those whose lives feel, for others, for those whose lives feel so full, they're bursting at the seams. And we can cry out to God in lament for our world, which is suffering in ways that sometimes words cannot describe. So we lament not only for ourselves, but we lament for others. and we lament for our world as well. In fact, I think this is a part of what it means to be the church. I think this is a part of the role of the church. This is pain within pain, the pain of the world within and mirroring the pain of the church within and mirroring the pain of the world. We cry out to God on behalf of the world. But even still, even with this rich biblical tradition of lament, sometimes we can still find ourselves at a loss for words, too weak to be able to pray as we ought. This is what Paul goes on to speak about in verses 26 and 27. See, when we're weak, the Spirit of God himself helps us, comes alongside us, and gives us and intercedes for us on our behalf. It's quite remarkable. Like, sometimes we read over verses like this, but if we stop to think about what's actually being said, it's mind-blowing, really. So at the very point where we find ourselves in pain and sorrow, too deep for words, God's own Spirit is there with power, with these powerful groans. So we've spoken about how creation is groaning, and we talked about how we ourselves groan as well, but it's kind of surprising to see that here the Spirit of God himself is also groaning. In fact, the Spirit of God is groaning with wordless groans. I mean, when the third person of the Trinity, the Spirit of God himself, is without words, you know things are pretty bad. And that's what we see here. You see, faced with our world in chaos and even the church can be in a bit of a mess, we don't see God standing to one side and thinking, man, I wish you guys would get your act together or something like that. God is so much better than that. God, the Spirit, comes into that place of pain so that our griefs and our sorrows and our loves are taken up into the griefs and sorrows and loves of God himself. This is how good our God is. So not only is creation groaning, but we are groaning along with creation. And the Spirit of God himself is helping us. What's amazing is we do not have a God who distances himself from suffering. We have a God who enters into suffering, both in these wordless groans that we read about in this passage, but ultimately in the person of Jesus, in the cry of Christ on the cross, as he quotes the lament of Psalm 22 when he says, my God, why have you abandoned me? See, Jesus himself laments. And the good news is that even as we have a God who enters into suffering, even as we have a God who is not distancing himself from the pain of this world, that is groaning on our behalf, we also have a God of hope, a God who raises the dead, a God who, so while that there is a cross, there is also a resurrection. That death doesn't get the final word. Hope does. And so that's the other resource that this passage offers us. It's hope. And once again, this hope is not just for us. It's for creation itself. Paul describes creation as waiting in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. The image that's used here is like someone on tiptoes with expectation, someone who's at the edge of their seat, someone who's kind of craning their neck to see around the corner. It's excitement, it's hope, it's expectation. In the midst of the groaning, in the midst of the suffering that creation is going through, there is also this eager anticipation. So, but what does Paul mean when he's talking about us being revealed as the children of God? Well, I think the first thing to notice is that if you're revealing something, then it already exists. So Paul doesn't say here that creation is waiting for us to become the children of God, but that this is something that is still to be revealed. It's a present reality, but that present reality is hidden from view. So Paul already talked about earlier in this chapter, in verse 14, that to be the children of God means to be led by the Spirit of God. So to be children of God means that we don't rely on our own wisdom, on our own ability, but we are led by the Spirit. So to put it simply, to be children of God is to say yes to God. But we still need to, but what does he mean by being revealed as the children of God? The thing is that even as children of God, we still go through the same groaning and the same suffering that we see in the rest of creation. Being children of God, it doesn't mean that we immediately receive life to the full in its fullness. This is a present reality, but it's also one that's still to be revealed. That's why in verse 23, Paul says that to be revealed, to receive our adoption as sonship, means the redemption of our bodies. See, this is our hope. This is not only our hope, but it's also the hope of all creation. That this present state of frustration, this present state of hevel that we've been talking about over the past few weeks, this bondage to decay that we read in this passage, will one day be done away with. But notice that this hope that we have is an embodied hope. Our hope is not for us to be whisked away to some immaterial plane somewhere, to be souls floating in space. But this world, that this creation will be set free from its bondage to decay. Our hope is for this world, for this material world, for our physical bodies to be redeemed and renewed and restored. Our hope is what John the visionary in Revelation 21 calls the new heavens and the new earth, or what Jesus calls in Matthew 19 the renewal of all things. See, but as Paul says in this passage, hope that is seen is no hope at all. So this stuff is still hidden. We're still going through it here on earth. We're not experiencing this renewal just yet. It can be easy to ask, I think, as Christians, like if we're Christians, why are we not experiencing this now? If Jesus came to bring life and life to the full, why are we not experiencing Jesus' abundant life in its fullness today? Now, amazingly, some people would say that we are. Some people would say that the new heavens and the new earth arrived with Jesus. And with all due respect, I would say that those people need to get out more because our world is suffering. Our world is in pain. That life, more often than not, is hevel. So why is it? Why is it that we are kind of in this in-between state? Well, this might not clear it up much more, but Paul puts it this way in 1 Corinthians, that the culmination of the ages, or the ends of the ages, have come upon us. What he means by this is that the old is on its way out and the new has begun. We're at the ends of the ages. That this is why we can experience Jesus' healing, restoring, and abundant life here today, while also experiencing the suffering and decay of this present age. This is the hope that we have. But hope for Christians is not just like wishful thinking. It's not just like blind optimism, because we have a very sure reason for our hope. Our hope is grounded in the resurrection of Jesus. Our hope is in a God who stepped into history in the person of Jesus. A God who not only in the person of Jesus died, but rose again by the power of the Spirit of God. That same God whose first fruits we have received. So while this hope is unseen because we haven't had our bodies redeemed yet, this is not a blind hope because we can look to the resurrection of the Son of God as the anchor for our hope. So I'd like to invite up the worship team now as I come to a close and talk about what does this mean for us today and the full lives that we often experience today. See, if I could sum it up, it would be this, that we lament for today as we hope for tomorrow. And that's a capital T, tomorrow. That's an ultimate that's too long of a word for a sermon, but it's the ultimate kind of tomorrow. So I don't know where you're at this morning. As you reflect on the series that we've had, and more broadly as we reflect on the state of our world. But this passage offers us these two resources of lament and hope. Which one do you need to draw on this morning? Maybe if you reflect on what you're going through at the moment, you need that cry out to God, that lament, that groan from the depths of your heart. Maybe you don't even have the words and you need the help of the Psalms and more importantly of the Spirit of God himself. And maybe for some of you, maybe even lament is not a place that you normally go. Maybe it's not something you feel very comfortable with. Maybe you're the kind of person who can be quite optimistic, can see the goodness of God in all kinds of situations. I want to say that doesn't mean that now is not the time to lament. See, Jesus was able to see the goodness of God, but he laments, as does the Spirit. Lamenting is not a lack of faith. It's not a lack of awareness of the goodness of God. It's just recognizing that things are not the way they should be. And even if you don't feel the pain that is behind lament, maybe you're not going through that kind of thing at the moment. As I mentioned earlier, lament doesn't need to be about us. Maybe you don't feel the pain of lament right now, but you can still cry out and groan on behalf of those who are in pain, on behalf of our world, which is in pain. So maybe for you, now is a time for lament. But for others of you, maybe it's a time for hope. Maybe now is a time to remind yourself that what we experience here in this present age is not the end of the story. Maybe it's time to read the stories about the resurrection of Jesus and reflect on what that means for us, even us today. And allow the Spirit of God to stir up a confident hope in the goodness of God. Because some people might struggle with lament, but others, maybe you go to lament too quickly or stay there too long. So maybe this is a time to cultivate hope. Hope, after all, is what gets the final word. But I leave it with you. And I invite you to engage with God as we step into a time of worship and allow, if what you need right now is to cry out to God in lament, or if what you need to do right now is to focus on the hope that we have, or maybe some beautiful mix of both as we see in the Psalms. I invite you to do that as we spend some time in worship right now. And I'm just going to pray and we'll head into that time. God, you are good. You are so good that you even enter into our times of pain and groan on our behalf. God, help us. Help us to lament and cry out to you. Help us to exercise our faith in you in that way. But let us also hope and trust in you. May our confidence be in the resurrection of Jesus, that death does not get the final word, that the world as we see it right now is not the way the world will be in the end, that your goodness will reign in the end. So we praise you, God, for that. We thank you for your goodness. Amen.